Hey guys, we all know how thoughtful we get when we're in the shower. And I was just in there thinking about what type of content I could bring to you guys. Not only just to tell you what decks I'm playing and some strategies or combos, as well as products I've been playing with, but maybe something that'll help you out just in general. Maybe something that, you struggle with, maybe something that uh, you're interested in getting into, and that's deck building. I really like making decks, and I'll go over my strategy for making decks as well as my three main considerations, and I think what should be everybody's three main considerations when building decks. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. I think the overall thing to consider, there's three main considerations when you're deck building, but I'll tell you first how I usually go about deck building. Um, First, I usually start with what we call net decking, and that's essentially taking a list that somebody else has come up with and throwing that into EDO Pro or Dueling Book or something and playing around with it and seeing what things I can change out to improve it, see what things I think work, what things I feel like don't work. There's a lot of intelligent people in our community who have been playing these decks for a long time. And a great example of that, if you check out the first episode of the Meta Show on my channel, Teramic piloted Drytron for a long time, and I think you were a little tilted. I think we're good now, but piloted Drytron for a long time and has figured out a lot of these quirks and a lot of the ratios, and it's just absolute silliness to not use that to your advantage. So what you do is you start with something like, if you're ever going to play Drytron, you start with Terramix deck, and this is what I did for Drytron. I started with Terramix deck, and then I did little tweaks that I personally thought or personally found would increase the consistency or increase your draw power or something like that. So my suggestion to you is, if you're thinking about playing a particular archetype or a particular deck, go ahead and net deck to start. It might feel like cheating, but it doesn't make any sense to waste all that time trying to build a deck from scratch when I'm almost 100% sure that somebody has come up with a list similar to what you're thinking. So go ahead, look that deck up, start with that, play around with it like on a simulator before you even pick up cards, and then after you figure out what tweaks you want to make, then you can actually pick up the cards and you can keep making your own version of that deck. And that's how I personally go about it. So next I want to get into these three main considerations when I'm tweaking a deck and starting a deck. Like I said, I usually start on the net deck, so I usually have an idea just based off of that list, what I'm working with. But when I'm tweaking it, there's three main considerations that I want to keep in mind when I'm picking what cards to take out, what cards to add in. And that's something that you can use both if you're starting a deck from scratch, as well as if you are, tweaking a deck that you've net decked. So I'm going to take a drink of coffee here. And now we can jump right into these. I think the best place to start with a deck is the win condition. And that's because every deck has to have a win condition. The whole point in playing a deck is that you're going to win. You don't want to lose. So if you're going to plan on winning, you should probably have a pretty solid plan about how you're going to do that. Now, a lot of decks play like these generic strategies where they use pretty generic monsters that are easy to get out, like Zeus or Dragoon or Access Code, where your win condition is to turbo out these monsters as fast as possible and essentially dominate your opponent with these extra strong monsters with these really strong effects. And on top of that, build up a defense of those monsters so that way your opponent can't out them with silly spell, trap, or monster effects. So a good example of this is in Drytron. If you're playing the Vanities version, your goal is to get out Vanities because, it's a 2500 attack body, plus it has the effect to not allow your opponent to special summon. So in itself, it protects itself because your opponent can't special summon. But at the same time, that's its only effect and it's relatively low attack. So you don't want it to get outed by a monster effect or something like that. So what you do on top of that is you have to build your win condition around getting vanities out as well as building up negates. And that's why you see a lot of the Drytron decks focusing on getting Herald of Ultimateness or Perfection out, or building up other cards with negates, or building up hand traps with negates or something like that to protect that vanity. And these are the types of things you need to consider when you're thinking of win conditions. A lot of times a deck's goal is to essentially stay alive long enough to see an opportunity to go into something like Access Code or Boral Sword Dragon, and then go in for an OTK because of the high attack value those monsters do to their effects. This is another win condition that you can kind of target at. But aside from, these generic cards, there's also decks where their win conditions are predicated around the idea of a control strategy or a stall / burn strategy or something like that. And the idea of these decks is essentially to stay alive. And by staying alive, your opponent then uses up all of their resources. You can kind of figure out how to get around their monsters. You have, outs to those big boss monsters, so that way you can get them off the field without having to have your big boss monster out. And then you can do something like go into Boral Sword Access Code fairly easy through link climbing or something, and then hit in for as much damage as possible and try to go for that OTK. And that, in a lot of cases, your win condition. So just for a couple examples, I'll just go through some of my decks. Like I said, with Drytron, my win condition is usually Ultimateness to stall out your opponent with negates, and then go in with Ultimateness, Vanities, go into Boral Sword on the next turn, Appaloosa, things like that, and hit in for as much damage as possible. Basically, don't let your opponent play Yu-Gi-Oh! On their turn, so that way they can't stop you from doing damage. Other examples, you all know I love Sky Strikers. I hope to do a list here soon of Sky Strikers actually, so you'll want to check that out. But that my usual win condition in Sky Strikers is essentially stall as long as possible and chip away at life points, attacking directly with Hayate. And then at whatever point in time I have the ability to link climb into Boral Sword Dragon, or I actually play a version of the deck too where I include Anaconda and Dragoon. And essentially what both of these link climbing and the Dragoon situation have in common is that I can essentially go into a two monster version of those. So, if I get Ray and I can stall long enough with a monster on board, and when a Sky Striker link monster gets destroyed, Ray brings herself back. So you usually have those resources recurring themselves as well with the spells. So when you have Ray or one of the link monsters out or something, and you draw into a tuner monster, which almost all of my hand traps are tuner monsters in that deck, you then can normal summon one of them and go into Halki Fibrax, and then bring back Effect Veiler and go into Selene, and then bring back another Effect Veiler, probably Spellcaster, and go into Boral Sword Dragon from there. The other thing you can do is, if you say you draw a non-tuner monster and you can't link climb, or you're worried about your opponent negating that many summons or something, I'm not sure, I can't think of anything off the top of my head at that point in the game as far as number of summons, but say you draw something that's not a tuner, for instance, you can link 2 into Anaconda and special summon Dragoon and have a 2-card Dragoon. So, by basically having Halki Fibrax, Selene, Boral Sword, Dragoon, and Anaconda, those 5 cards in your extra deck, as well as tuners for hand traps, Effect Veiler in there, Dark Magician, Red Eyes Fusion, and Red Eyes, which the only bricks then are Red Eyes and Dark Magician. But by playing all those in the deck, you have multiple win conditions, and you have a way to get to those monsters very easily whenever you have the ability to shoot in for damage or you need to build up your board. The second thing to consider is consistency. And this kind of goes along with that. You want to be able to get to your win condition as fast as possible. And if you draw your opening hand and you don't consistently draw the pieces you need to get to that win condition, your deck is going to regularly fail. And I kind of think about it like this. So usually most people play a 40 card deck. Some people play a 60 card deck depending on the deck and how searchable it is and stuff like that. But let's say we have a 40 card deck, and let's say the duel lasts 4 turns, because there's a lot of decks that can end the game in 4 turns if you don't draw into something to stop them. So if we have 4 turns, and say you go second, so you draw on your first turn. So you start with 6 cards on turn 1. So turn 2 would be 7, turn 3 would be 8, turn 4 would be 9. So let's say 5 turns, just so we have 10 cards. So 10 cards is a quarter of your deck. So you essentially get a quarter of your deck to work with during the entire duel, unless you have some way to search your deck or draw into more cards. And the point being that if you don't have consistency for your deck, those 10 cards all of a sudden become not helpful. You need those 10 cards that you get out of your deck to be essentially the same 10 cards every time and be able to perform the same actions every single time. So this is where, something like Searchers and added draw power like Pot of Desires or Pot of Greed, who knows what Pot of Greed does, but obviously banned, it was just a joke. But these cards are what give you extra consistency in your deck. So that's something you really need to consider when you're figuring out the ratios of monsters you want, when you're figuring out, exactly what extra cards you want. And this will kind of lead us into our next section here. But, if some of your cards are searchers, like some of your cards in your archetype are searchers, you'll really want to kind of max out on those, so that way you can get into your main body of your deck, search out the cards you need to actually do your combo. And that's like, if you're trying to develop a combo too, searching for cards is a big part of your combo. So searchers are a big thing. Being able to draw cards is a huge thing. And there's a lot of tech options, like generic tech options like Pot of Desires, Pot of Prosperity, Pot of Extravagance, and Duality, things like that. But really you need your engine to be very consistent as well. And that's why we play multiples of cards. That's why we play the cards. That's why we max out on the cards that can search other cards in the engine. So keep that in mind when you're deck building. You want to have consistency. And a good example of this, in my opinion, again, is the Drytron deck. I was just working on this, so it's fresh in my mind. So your main play starters for the Drytron engine are going to be Zeta and Alpha. So we want to max out on Zeta and Alpha. That's why I play 3 of each of those. A combo piece that you usually search out during the combo is Gamma. But Gamma isn't really a play starter. But since we can search it, it's not like we only need 1 of it, because we don't need to draw it. It's not a play starter, so we don't need it in our hand. And we can search it, so it's not a big deal that there's only 1 of it in the deck. And then on top of that, you have Delta. And the reason we play 2 Delta is because it's not really a play starter, so you don't necessarily want to have it in your hand. But it's nice to have that extra card that allows you to draw more cards. So the idea is that having multiple of those increases the total number of Drytron names in your deck, which allows you to ditch different cards. If you draw an Alpha and a Delta, then you can ditch the Delta to summon the Alpha and things like that. So you really need to consider that, like number of names, number of individual cards, which ones are play starters, which ones are combo pieces, which ones are searchable, which ones are searchers, when you're developing the consistency of the deck. If you're feeling statistical, one good way to do this is essentially go into a statistics analyzer, which I'll share some links down below where you can do that. You can even do it on just Google, I think. And I remember Simo doing a good video of how to do these types of calculations as well. So I'll share that link, I think, down below too. So you can check out his video on this as far as the statistics and the drawing. But the idea is that you go through your deck and you figure out how many of these individual cards get me to the card that I need to do my plays, or how many of these cards can I draw that I need to see this, or like if you have a 2-card combo that you want to see a lot of the time, how often will I draw that 2-card combo, considering, so like in the Drytron deck, you play 3 Cyber Emergency, 3 Nova, 3 Alpha, so you essentially have 9 Alpha. So, if you're worried about getting to Alpha, 9 of your 10 cards get you to Alpha. So that's pretty good, considering one draw gets you about 25% chance of getting Alpha, and on your opening turn you get at least 5 draws. And that's where the statistical analysis comes in. You can figure out what percentages get you there, how many hand traps you should play, and that concept gets us to our last section, our last consideration for deck building, and that's tech options, or what I call tech options. There's a couple things that fall under tech options in my opinion. The primary things that fall under tech options are your generic cards. So like your OTK enablers like Dragoon, Zeus, Access Code, Boral Sword, Appaloosa, things like that. I consider those tech options because which one you use drastically depends on what decks you're facing as well as what decks you're using, which means to me that they're tech options, not specific. And as well as that, there's, your generic cards that allow you to search other cards or allow you to draw cards like Pot of Duality, Pot of Prosperity, all those other pot cards. And, other tech options include anti-meta type cards. So Mystic Mine is a great example. I play Mystic Mine in my Sky Striker deck because, if I Mystic Mine my opponent with 3 monsters on board and I get Hayate out and they don't have an out to Mystic Mine, which really not that hard to out, but I can just keep poking in with Hayate, attacking directly until their life points go to 0. So just things like that, your anti-meta cards. And then the other thing to consider for tech options is your hand traps and your techie extra deck cards like Nightmare Unicorn and Nightmare Phoenix are pretty popular ones right now. Essentially, all of these cards are targeted at specific decks that work well with your deck, and that's what makes them tech options, in my opinion. What your goal is here in understanding this consideration, this category, is getting cards that specifically target the decks that you anticipate playing. And that's where understanding the decks you're playing against, the people you're playing against, and the decks you expect to see is drastically important for performance. Because if you come into, say you're playing Drytron, and you come in not prepared to deal with Droll and Lockbird and Cycle Reader and things like that, you're going to have a hard time trying to duel your opponent when they're drolling you and cycle reading you and skullmeistering you, and you weren't prepared for it, and you don't have outs to it, and you don't know how to play around it. So part of it is knowing how your deck works and being able to play around it. But as far as deck building goes, you can tech in options, and that allows you to play around them a little bit more easily. So for example, I was just listening to Simo's video about upcoming cards in the OCG that gives us an idea of what's possibly going to happen in TCG. And the Drytron player that he was talking about, instead of playing 3 Cyber Emergency, played 3 more Drytron names to play around Droll and Lockbird. The idea being that since Droll and Lockbird doesn't let you draw cards from your deck, the Cyber Emergency ends up being a dead card, and all you're going to do is use it to search a Drytron name anyway. So the idea is that I didn't lose any consistency in my deck by playing 3 more Drytron names, because I essentially still have 3 Drytron names. Instead of, you're going to use the Cyber Emergencies to search a Drytron name, so 3 Cyber Emergencies equals 3 Drytron names. The reason you play 3 Cyber Emergencies is because then you can search Alpha or Zeta and have 6 of those instead of 3 of those. But you still have Nova, you still have other ways to get to those cards, so it's not that big of a deal. the idea is that now, if you draw the Drytron names, instead of drawing a card that searches the Drytron names, you now don't have to play through Droll Lockbird to get to that Drytron name. So those are the things you need to consider as far as tech options, in my opinion. That, like, while that's engine related, that's what tech options are to me. It's like not just blindly considering, oh, how do I increase the consistency of my deck and what's my win condition. The teching out of your deck considers what hand traps negate my opponent's cards the best, how do I play around the meta the best, as far as, like, you know, if you know that you're going to be playing a lot of Outlich or something, you know that you're going to need something to out those traps. If you know that you're going to be playing a lot of Drytron, you know that you're going to need to play around negates or stop their plays. So that's something that you really need to consider, but it's like on a certain basis depending on what deck you're playing and what deck you're playing against. So, you know, it's one of the most important things to being successful, but it's one of the most variable things to building your deck. And that's why, like, a lot of times when I share deck profiles, I try to identify which cards you guys could take out and replace, and depending on what you're playing against and things like that. So if you ever hear me in a deck building video where I'm like, oh, well, I play this, but you could take that out and play this, that means that for the deck to function, for the engine to function, you don't need those specific cards. But in my particular case, for the decks that I anticipate playing against and things like that, I think those cards are the best for the deck. And that's where your side deck comes in a lot too, which I'm not going to get into in this particular video. But the idea is just to have a toolbox of extra tech cards that you can switch in and out, depending on what decks you're playing against or how your deck seems to be doing. I think overall, that's all the helpful information I have as far as my deck building strategies and tips. Like I said, for doing the actual consistency and statistics calculations, check out the CMO video, which I'll link in the description down below. As far as any deck building help you could possibly need, go over to my Instagram account. I have a couple deck profiles posted there. I'll keep posting deck profiles. It's kind of my thing. And you can always message me and ask me about decks or about deck profiles. I'll either share one with you that I found online, or maybe I'll make one for you. But I appreciate you guys checking out the video. Leave some comments down below if you thought any of this helped. If anything you think helps other people build decks. If you have any helpful hints for people trying to build decks. If there's any other, you know, videos or anything like that that you think are helpful, go ahead and share those down in the comments below. Smash that like button and subscribe to the page if you like this content, if you found it helpful. Come on over, check out the rest of the videos, keep up with what we're going to be continuing throughout this journey of this YouTube channel. So thanks again for watching. Like and subscribe. Have a great day.